There is a cemetery in the interior of São Paulo state where one particular plot has not been visited by a single living relative in over 90 years. The flowers that occasionally appear there are left by strangers who do not know why they feel compelled to do it. I know this because for a long time I was one of those strangers, except I was not visiting. I was employed there. And what pulled me away from that employment had nothing to do with wages or hours or the condition of my knees. I will not begin with my name. I will begin with the sound. It was a Wednesday in February, the wet season, when the clay between the graves turns soft enough to swallow your boot if you stand still too long. I was draining a flooded pathway in the eastern quadrant when I heard something come out of the ground. Not from a specific grave. From the ground itself, as if the soil had inhaled and was releasing a long, low exhalation that carried with it the faintest trace of human speech. I crouched there with water pooling around my ankles and listened until the rain picked up again and buried whatever it was under the noise of 1,000 drops striking stone. That was my 11th year on the job. I had 7 more ahead of me. And in those 7 years, that sound would find me again and again, always in the same quadrant, always near the same burial plot, always carrying that faint residue of language just below the threshold of comprehension. But I am getting ahead of things. My career at the Cemiterio Municipal de Santa Teresa started when I was 41. I had been laid off from a textile factory in Americana and moved back to my hometown with a wife, 3 daughters, and the kind of desperation that makes a man say yes to anything. The cemetery administrator was a childhood friend of my father. He offered me the position over a glass of sugarcane liquor on a Saturday night, and by Monday morning I was learning how to operate a backhoe in clay soil without collapsing the walls of an adjacent grave. I stayed for 18 years. I left at 59, not because I found something better, but because my body began refusing to walk a certain path, and I decided to listen to it before it stopped cooperating altogether. The burial plot I need to tell you about belongs to a woman. Not a priest, not a soldier, not a politician. A woman named Andina Ferraz, who according to the cemetery's ledger was interred on August 14, 1931, at the age of 57. Her headstone is simple compared to the ornate mausoleum surrounding it in the eastern quadrant. Gray granite, rectangular, with her name and dates and a single line carved beneath them in Portuguese that reads Ajustica que os vivos negaram, os mortos neo esqueçam. The justice that the living denied, the dead do not forget. I read that inscription 100 times in my first year without giving it much thought. Cemeteries are full of dramatic epitaphs. People write strange things when grief is steering the pen. It was not until my 4th year, when I started asking older residents about the name Andina Ferraz, that the inscription began to feel less like poetry and more like a warning. The story I gathered came in pieces, from different mouths, over many years. None of the sources agreed on every detail, but the skeleton of the narrative was always the same. Andina had been a midwife. She served the rural communities surrounding the town for decades, delivering babies in farmhouses with dirt floors and kerosene light. She was respected in the way that essential people in poor communities are respected, with a mixture of gratitude and slight unease, because a woman who held that much intimate knowledge about that many families also held a kind of power, whether she intended to or not. At some point in the late 1920s, a child she delivered was born dead. The family was wealthy by local standards. They owned land. They had connections to the municipal government. And they decided, for reasons that shifted depending on who told the story, that Andina was responsible. Not through negligence. Through intention. The accusation was that she had cursed the child, or poisoned the mother, or performed some ritual during the delivery that condemned the infant. Witchcraft, in the vocabulary of the time. There was no trial. There did not need to be. In a town that size, in that era, an accusation from a powerful family carried the weight of a verdict. Andina was ostracized completely. Her clients stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street. The parish priest, a man whose name no one I spoke to could remember, or perhaps no one wanted to remember, denounced her from the pulpit during 3 consecutive Sunday masses. She died within 2 years of the accusation. The official cause listed in the cemetery records is pneumonia, but an old woman I spoke to in my 6th year, a woman in her 90s whose own mother had known Undina personally, told me the cause of death was simpler than that. She said Undina died because every single thread connecting her to the world of the living was severed, and a person cannot survive that, no matter how strong their lungs are. The headstone was paid for by Undina's sister, who lived in another state and arrived after the burial. The sister chose the inscription. Then she left and apparently never returned. That is the history. Now let me tell you what the history left behind. My first years working near that plot were unremarkable in any way I could point to with certainty. There was a feeling, yes. A texture to the air in the eastern quadrant that I noticed but attributed to the age of the section, to the larger trees, to the way old graves settle into the earth and create a kind of weighted atmosphere that newer sections lack. I was a practical man. I remain a practical man. I did not walk into that cemetery looking for ghosts, and I resisted the idea of them with every rational tool available to me for as long as I possibly could. The first undeniable thing happened in my 3rd year. I was repainting the iron number markers along the eastern pathway when I noticed that the temperature around Undina's plot was measurably different from the surrounding graves. I do not mean I felt a chill. I mean I could hold my hand at waist height over her headstone and feel warmth rising from the granite the way heat rises from asphalt in summer, except it was July, the coldest month, and the stone had been in shade since morning. I touched it. Warm. Not hot. Warm the way skin is warm. I touched the neighboring headstones. Cold, as expected. I went back to Undina's. Still warm. I stood there for a long time with my palm flat against the granite, trying to formulate a geological explanation involving underground water channels or decomposition gases or anything that would allow me to file this away and move on. I could not. I checked that stone periodically for the next 15 years. It was always warm. In rain, in frost, in the dead stillness of a winter midnight when I pulled overtime shifts, that stone carried warmth that had no source I could identify. The animals behaved strangely around the quadrant, but not in the way you might expect. They were not repelled. They were drawn to it. Dogs that occasionally wandered through gaps in the cemetery fence would settle near Undina's grave and lie there for hours with a calm that struck me as unusual, almost medicated. A stray with no apparent connection to the place would curl up against the base of her headstone as though it had found the safest spot in the world. One particular dog, a thin brown mutt with a torn ear, came back so consistently over several months that the groundskeeper started leaving water for it near the eastern gate. Then one morning it simply stopped coming. We never saw it again. The sounds began, as I said, in my 11th year. That first Wednesday in the rain was only the opening. Over the following months, I heard the exhalation 3 more times, always in the eastern quadrant, always when I was alone, always carrying that trace of speech that hovered just beyond the edge of recognition. On one occasion I brought a small tape recorder, the kind journalists used in those days, and left it running near the headstone for an hour while I worked 2 rows away. When I played the tape back in the guard booth, there was nothing on it except ambient cemetery noise, birdsong and wind and the distant rumble of a truck on the highway. Whatever produced that sound either could not be captured by the microphone or chose not to be. In my 13th year, a woman came to the administration office asking for the location of Undina Ferraz's grave. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed, clearly not from town. She said she was researching the history of midwifery in rural São Paulo for a university project. I walked her to the eastern quadrant and pointed out the headstone. She thanked me and I returned to my duties. 20 minutes later she appeared at the office again, visibly shaken. She said that while she was photographing the inscription, she heard a woman's voice directly beside her, not whispering but speaking at a normal conversational volume, say a sentence in Portuguese that she partially understood. The sentence, as best she could reconstruct it, was something about children. She could not recover the full phrase. She asked if there were speakers hidden in the cemetery for some kind of audio tour. There were not. She left quickly and did not come back for her photographs. I began paying attention to patterns in the disturbances. Over the following years, I noticed that the phenomena around Undina's grave intensified during two specific periods. The first was August, the month of her burial. The second was the week surrounding the anniversary of the accusation against her, which local oral history placed in late October or early November, though no one could pinpoint the exact date. During those windows, the warmth of the stone increased perceptibly. The sounds became more frequent. And twice, during August nights when I was working late, I smelled something in the eastern quadrant that did not belong there. It was a botanical smell, herbal, complex, the kind of scent associated with dried plants hung in bundles from a kitchen ceiling. A midwife's smell. There was no vegetation near that plot that could have produced it. I kept notes. Not in a dedicated notebook but in the margins of my work log, the ledger where I recorded daily tasks, plots maintained, headstones cleaned, paths cleared. If you knew what to look for, you could trace the history of that quadrant through years of marginal annotations. I never consolidated them into a single account because doing so would have meant admitting to myself that I was documenting something supernatural, and I was not ready for that admission until much later. The event that ended my career happened on a Tuesday evening in March, almost exactly on the anniversary of Undina's death according to the cemetery ledger. I was finishing a late shift. The cemetery closed to visitors at 5, but maintenance staff often stayed until 7 or later in the summer months. I was alone. The other groundskeeper had gone home early with a stomach complaint. I was walking the eastern quadrant doing a final check of the irrigation valves when the sound came again. But this time it was not the low exhalation I had grown accustomed to over the years. This time it was a voice, clear and unmistakable, speaking from somewhere very near Undina's headstone, and it was not a fragment or a murmur. It was a sustained utterance, several sentences long, spoken with the cadence and breath of a living person engaged in passionate speech. I could not make out most of the words. But I caught 3 of them distinctly, spoken in sequence, and they were "Eu sais quem." I know who. I stood frozen. The voice continued for another few seconds, then stopped with an abruptness that felt like a door closing. The silence that followed was not the weighted silence I had grown used to in that quadrant. It was a vacuum. A silence so total that I could hear my own blood moving through my ears. Then I saw her. She was standing on the far side of the headstone, partially obscured by the granite, visible from the shoulders up. A woman. Dark hair pulled back. A face that was weathered and angular in the way of someone who spent decades outdoors. She was looking at me with an expression that I have spent every day since trying to accurately name and have failed every time. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was not sorrow, though sorrow was somewhere in it too. The closest I have come is this. It was the expression of someone who has been trying to tell you something for a very long time and has finally realized that you are not the person who needs to hear it. The disappointment in that look was worse than any rage could have been. She held my gaze for a span I cannot measure. Then the image lost coherence the way a reflection on water loses coherence when a stone drops into it, not vanishing but dispersing, becoming movement without form until there was nothing left but the headstone and the trees and the sound of my own jagged breathing. I finished the shift. I locked the gates. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours without speaking. My wife knew something had happened because she had been married to me long enough to know when silence meant thinking and when silence meant something else. She did not press. The next morning I called the administrator and gave my notice. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. He did not believe me but he accepted the resignation. That was 6 years ago. I have not returned to the cemetery. I do not avoid the town or the street it sits on, but I have not walked through those gates and I do not intend to. Not because I am afraid of Undina Ferraz. I was never afraid of her. What I felt in that quadrant over 18 years was never fear. It was the slow, accumulating pressure of proximity to something unresolved, something that has been waiting for an acknowledgement that no one alive knows how to give. A few months after I left, I was buying bread at the bakery on Rua 7 de Setembro when a young man behind me in line asked if I was the one who used to work at Santa Teresa. He was new on the grounds crew. Maybe 25, strong build, the kind of easy confidence that comes from not yet having encountered anything that shakes it. He did not ask directly. He asked whether the eastern section had always been warmer than the rest of the cemetery. I told him it had. He chewed on that for a moment. Then he asked if I had any advice. I told him to do his job well in that quadrant, to treat the graves with care, and to listen when the air changed but not to expect answers. He looked unsatisfied with that response. I understood. I would have been unsatisfied too, at his age. We paid for our bread and parted. I think about Andina Ferraz most often in August, when the dry season turns the hills brown and the air smells like dust and old wood. I think about a woman who spent her life bringing children into the world and was destroyed for it by people who needed someone to blame for a tragedy that had no villain. I think about the inscription her sister chose. The justice that the living denied. I think about that voice in the quadrant saying "Eu sei quem." I know who. And I wonder whether she was talking about the family that accused her, or the priest who condemned her from the pulpit, or the neighbors who turned their backs. Or whether after 90 years of silence and warmth and sound rising from the earth, she was simply stating a fact that no one had been brave enough to confirm. That she knew. That she had always known. And that knowing, without anyone to receive it, had become its own kind of sentence, longer and heavier than the one the living had imposed, because at least the living sentence had an end. Some wounds close. Some do not. And some, given enough time and enough silence, begin to speak for themselves.